Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. In today's episode, I'm going to take you through a presentation I recently did on my personal tips and methodology for finding success in the home reef aquarium. Alright, so recently I got an incredibly humbling email from the team at the Aquarium Vet where they're letting me know that they are holding a E-Reef conference and they would like me to present. Now, I've seen some of the conferences from the Aquarium Vet team before and they are absolutely top shelf when it comes to really high quality information from some fantastically recognized and highly educated presenters. So it did leave me scratching my head a little bit as to why I would be asked to present. But once we got chatting, they said that they'd love to see a presentation on some tips and some secrets and some methodologies on how to maintain a successful reef tank. And to that, I felt quite comfortable in presenting because I've done it quite a few times now. And whilst I don't have the silver bullet, I do have a few tips that people seem to gloss over at the start. So that's what I based my presentation around. Now, just before we jump into that presentation, because I have been able to share that presentation with you guys here on this channel for free, I will point out that the entire 4 days worth of presentations are available to purchase, which you can then view online for 90 days following your purchase. I think it's about $62 Australian to purchase, and you've got presenters like we've got Daniel Kimberley from Monsoon Aquatics, we've got Julian Sprung, we've got the Aquarium Vet himself, Rob Jones, we've got Julian and Eshan from Triton, we've got, let's see who else here. Bradley Don't was a presentation I really enjoyed from over in Ningaloo Aquarium about how some of the considerations on building a public aquarium-sized living reef tank, which a lot of that information flowed really nicely back into a large home aquarium, and a whole host of other presenters there. This is a full 4-day conference, and it was absolutely educational, and despite being in the hobby for some time now, I felt like the absolute newbie in the room and learnt so much. So whilst I'm going to give this presentation for you for free, and by all means enjoy my humble PowerPoint presentation, be sure to jump on the Aquarium Vet website. I'll give you a link to their conference page where you can check out all the conferences they got available. There's a wicked agenda there. There is a nice little bio of each of the presenters and a little spiel about what their presentation is about. Be sure to get over there and check it out, and also keep an eye out for future conferences. I know I'll be joining all of them from now on. So anyway, that's enough rambling from me. I'll run the presentation and see what you guys think about it. Cheers.
So first speaker is Sam Parker, and the title of his talk is A Simple Methodology to Finding Success with Home Reef Aquariums. I asked Sam to describe himself, and he said he was a reef aquarium enthusiast and a YouTube creator. And this is what Sam looks like with his home tank. So Sam, are you there?
I am, yes.
Good morning. Right, now we'll do this handover of the screen.
Good to go, fantastic. All right, I hope everyone's joining in and can hear me clearly, and thank you very much for having me. I feel very honoured to be a part of the panel, not just for today, but for the whole conference. It's quite humbling to be just a home reef enthusiast, albeit as a YouTuber as well, but to be listed among some of the names across this 4-day conference is quite special. So hopefully my presentation is obviously not as scientific or as groundbreaking as some of the things we've seen so far, but it's a little bit of common sense, and it's something that I've found a fair bit of use with over the last couple of years, where I've had a lot of people either looking to come from freshwater into marine, or if we just have friends or family come over and see our reef tanks here and they want to set them up. And I've just been very mindful over the last few years of setting people up for success rather than seeing them struggle and then eventually fail in the hobby, which has consequences for all of us, really. So I've got this presentation here, A Simple Methodology to Finding Success with a Home Reef Aquarium. So let's jump into it. So starting off, who am I? As Rob alluded to, I am just a hobbyist, but I'm a hobbyist that got a little bit further involved. I've been in this hobby for about 8 years now, so personally I still consider myself a newbie, but Funnily enough, as sort of mentioned in the title of the presentation, it's so many people only really make that 1 year mark before getting out. So within the hobby itself, a lot of people think 8 years is a veteran, which truly scares me because I don't consider anyone a veteran until they've been in the hobby for maybe 30 years. Now, I say that I got a little bit further involved. How did I get further involved? I've obviously got a reef of my own. I've got currently 6 in the house. The one pictured here has actually just been shut down. I've got a new, what I'm calling a dream reef tank going in its place, which has been a long time plan, lots and lots of plotting and scheming and saving and working through every single little detail to make it the perfect reef tank that I can. But this was my outgoing reef tank that ran for 7 years. That photo there was taken at about the 4 year mark. I think from that point onwards, about the only thing that changed is the large green staghorn in the middle there, which we refer to as Dallas in Australia. That eventually ended up pretty much taking over the tank. It became a basically a 3-foot cube of solid green staghorn, which a lot of reef keeping elitists would tell me to remove that and put in some of those crazy Walt Disney acros and things like that. But personally, I love the Dallas. It is a beautiful coral, and just because it's easy to keep doesn't mean it's not a good thing. Now, as also alluded to, I am also a YouTuber. It's been one of these things where reef keeping is a funny hobby where it's something that does require so much interaction with other people, yet we seem to do so much of it in isolation, maybe talking to our local fish shop alone, but it's an area that's evolving so quickly with new products, new technologies, new concepts, new methodologies, and it's a hobby that's moved so drastically in the last year or two that we're all big sponges trying to absorb knowledge. So I found myself checking out YouTube a lot, and then before I knew it, there was a few things I was doing, and I was sending information to people just on a bespoke manner. And then I ended up taking videos of things because it was easier to explain things on a video than it was to type it out, particularly once you've typed it out 10 or 12 times. So I'd take a video of it, and then I decided that I may as well put the video on YouTube, because then I wouldn't have to take the video again every time when someone asked me. I could just send them a link to the video. Before you knew it, I had quite a few views, and I thought, well, I may as well have a go at this properly. So I started up a YouTube channel, which has just surpassed 9,500 subscribers, and we've gone over 1 million views. So it's gone pretty well in the last couple of years. So if you're at all interested, be sure to check out Parker's Reef. Your subscription, which costs nothing at all, obviously, is greatly welcomed. Now, the next thing I did, and this is something I got right into last year / start of this year before the world changed with coronavirus, and that was to become an event manager. This actually started off with the image on the bottom of this slide, which was frag stock. Now, the idea here was I have no connection. I actually work for a university. I don't actually work in the aquarium field at all. However, I've got a few good friends that run fish stores, and I also have a lot of reef keeping friends that do fragging and things at home. And I could see this strange and awkward sort of social divide between local fish stores and fraggists, where there was this underlying tone of fish stores feeling that that home fraggers were undercutting them and trying to put them out of business, and then some resentment coming back from the hobbyists back towards the fish shop, and it was building this nasty culture. So I came up with this event called Frag Stock, which was to bring home fraggers into their local fish store for a day where they could sell their frags in store in an environment that would benefit both the hobbyist and the local fish shop. That concept ended up turning out to be quite popular. And through 2019, we did shows in Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland, Newcastle, and Perth. Every one of them was quite successful. There, one in Sydney was probably the most successful. We had about 600 people come through the shop in a couple of hours, which was on a Saturday night. And that's it. When I say in Sydney, it was in Western Sydney at a aquarium there called Bespoke Aquariums, and it was quite an odd sight to see people lined up around the block on a Saturday night in Western Sydney. And when passerbys would go past and say, "What's the event? What's happening?" and they said they were there to buy pieces of coral, it got a few strange looks. But that event ended up being quite successful. That then led on to
an event that we did, thankfully, this year, just before we scraped it in 2 weeks before COVID-19 lockdowns began. And that was Underwater Pet Expo Australia. And that was another divide that I saw in the community, in the aquarium community, between freshwater and marine enthusiasts, where there was, for some reason we're both in very similar games, but there wasn't a lot of harmony between the two areas. Personally, I know nothing about freshwater, but I was curious to learn a bit more about it. So we ended up creating this event at Melbourne Showgrounds, which we ended up having a few thousand people come through the door over the 2 days. It brought in a lot of wholesalers, distributors, retailers, as well as hobbyists all together. And it's quite a great, successful event. So as soon as COVID goes away, we can start planning 2021. All right. Last but not least, how I've got further involved is I've been a local fish shop volunteer. Now, I say volunteer, and that's because I'm not actually asking for any payment. A good friend of mine runs a local fish shop in Melbourne, and with the COVID-19 restrictions, it's been a pretty tough time for him this year. There's also, on a personal aspect, it's been a difficult time for me, where I quite enjoy the social aspect of reef keeping. And when you're told to stay inside your home and not leave for any reason, it's quite difficult to chat to people about how their tanks are going and see new fish and new corals and things like that. I've also, as you saw earlier on, I've been planning my new Dream Reef tank, which is something that Dave, the gentleman pictured there, has been helping a lot with. So we basically did a trade for labor. The time he spends working on my tank is the time I give back working in his shop, and it ends up being a really mutually beneficial outcome, in that I get to be around the fish and corals. I have a legal reason to get out of the house once a week. I go to work at his store on a Saturday and just help him get through these COVID-19 times, where I can use my photography skills and things like that, and some online work to get his coral and fish and dry goods up on the website, so that he can then deliver them and he can keep his doors open, basically, and food on his plate. All right, onto the main point of the presentation, and that is why is it important to help people find success? Now, I mean, ultimately we all want to see everyone succeed in this hobby, but there's a real ripple effect, I feel, particularly in Australia, where we have a fairly small population compared to places like America, where we don't have a huge amount of aquariums in homes throughout Australia. And it's a very small market when you're talking big international brands, and a number of items and products and you name it doesn't actually make it to Australia, just because it's the expense and the effort involved in bringing something to Australia versus the reward they get for our small market isn't quite there. That can compound when you've then got people leaving the hobby, and we've got people leaving the hobby for all sorts of reasons. I mean, we've got just natural attrition. Sometimes people pass away, or people just leave the hobby because they've been in it for a long time, or they've moved house and their new house can't have a fish tank, or exponential electricity prices, or the one that I think is totally avoidable is they have problems with their tank and they just have enough of it and shut it down. Now, obviously, if we have people leaving the hobby, we need to have new people coming into the hobby. Otherwise, the hobby goes away. It's a simple maths problem. If people are leaving and people are not joining or not staying in, the hobby goes away. And for someone like myself that's heavily invested in this hobby, if we don't have local fish stores, if we don't have major brands sending products to Australia, we've got ourselves a problem. And then last but not least, the lowest common denominator, at least in my opinion, is we need to help people find success, if for no other reason other than the sake of the animals. If people are going to fill out their fish tanks with fish and corals, I don't want to see them go through a hard time. I want to see the fish and corals thrive and succeed and live in a good environment. And hopefully that person will feel very proud of their tank and continue to have good success and continue to keep these animals in good health. Now, why or how are people getting it wrong in 2020, in an age where we've got more success, more of an idea, more of an understanding, more technology, more ways to get aquarium keeping right? How are people getting it wrong? And there's a whole heap of reasons here, and my final point on that slide there is there's a million other reasons, but some of the major reasons, particularly in 2020, I find, is that there is conflicting advice. In a Facebook era where everyone's got an opinion, someone asks a question about why have they got this algae in their tank, they'll get 32 different reasons. The people that gave those 32 different reasons will start arguing as to who's right, who's wrong. It's incredibly overwhelming for the person who just has the problem that is just trying to get it resolved. They ended up feeling overwhelmed, and they eventually go, this is way too difficult, I'm just going to shut it down, I'm throwing money at this, I don't like the look of the tank, it's too much. The next reason there is very similar in the learning curve. In an era where we have more information on reef keeping than we ever have before, it can be absolutely overwhelming. No longer do we just talk about, it's a long time ago, but no longer do we talk about just monitoring pH or just doing a water change. We now talk about automated devices that are testing alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, and then we've even got ion probes and things coming along the way that are testing potassium and nitrates and all sorts of things hourly on their own every day. And then you have to all of a sudden become a data analyst and interpret those results, and then can see trends that are going to lead to potential problem in your fish tank. It's a significant learning curve that throws people from the get-go. Next up, and this is something that I don't think has got any better, and that's costs. Whilst you can set up a reef tank for a fairly moderate budget these days, there's definitely a trend to spending more and more on your aquarium. I guess the social dilemma around people sort of turning their nose up to someone that's done something a little bit DIY or hasn't used a top shelf brand or something along those lines is becoming a little bit more common. So costs can be a huge thing, particularly ongoing costs. I mentioned before about electricity prices continuing to go up. When you get that electricity bill and it's significantly higher than expected, that can become a point of discussion in the household, and the fish tank there just churning through power can often be the item that has the big target on its back. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. And the last specific reason I'm going to mention there, and it's one that hasn't really changed for a long time, but it's people's ability for this reason has probably changed over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, maybe longer, and that's patience. We're definitely, this generation is definitely a instant gratification generation, particularly when you combine money with that. If someone spends good money on something, they expect to see results from it fairly instantly. So if someone spends, $4,000 on new lights for their reef tank, they want to see a difference within an hour of turning them on. Sometimes that can be realistic, sometimes that cannot be. Sometimes these changes won't really show their head for maybe 3, 6, 12 months. And that's a difficult path for a lot of people. So bearing in mind with all of these little dilemmas of where people are going wrong, the question becomes, how can we help? And there is an equal number of ways that we can help, but I've tried to narrow down into helping people get as much as they can right from the get-go. I find it so much easier to prepare yourself for success than to try and turn a sinking ship around. It's much easier to block that hole before you drop the boat in the ocean than to try and bucket it out when you're halfway across the Atlantic. So I get asked a lot of opinions on people setting up tanks, from people struggling, but most importantly, people looking to enter into the hobby. And that's the time I really try to help people out. They've got no opinions. They haven't been fed conflicting advice yet. They're coming in completely green-eyed. They've just possibly seen a reef tank and think it looks beautiful and have decided it's for them. They want to have it in their house. And how can you help them achieve success? So I've come up with a very, very simple model, which we'll go through now. And step one, and something that I don't know how it's not considered more often, but it is identifying the tank goals. It's such a logical thing, but the number of times that people seem to step over it and they'll think they'll work out the tank goals down the track. They'll get the tank up and running and they'll get a bit of a handle on things and see how good they are, and then they'll set the goal. by then they've already got all their infrastructure and everything in place. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as well. Sure, you can do it, but I find the best thing to do with someone that's looking to start up a reef tank is say, okay, here's a list of pictures. This is what some tanks look like. Which one are you hoping to achieve? Because sometimes what I consider to be a beautiful reef tank or what someone else considers to be a beautiful reef tank are drastically different. So we start off with an image like this. And I'm quite often surprised at the number of people that think this is unbelievably beautiful and they couldn't imagine anything more spectacular than a marine fish-only tank. And good luck to them. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Personally, I just look at this scape here and think how many Aquapora or LPS or even some soft corals I could put on there. But that's the beauty of this hobby. There is absolutely more than one way to tackle it. So your first option really here is the fish-only tank, and if that's what someone is after, it definitely can save you a lot of trouble in equipment, infrastructure, testing requirements, the learning curve. There's so many things you can cut back on, and if you are doing a fish-only tank, you don't need to know how to identify pests on corals or measuring things like potassium. You really need to just look after the fish health, which is just narrowing the scope quite a lot. Now, one thing I do need to be mindful of here is a number of people, particularly those that are just getting into the hobby, will say that they only want a fish-only tank, particularly if they're coming from a freshwater background. They'll have this impression that corals are too hard for them. They just want marine fish. However, once they get the tank set up, and then you pop over to see how they're going, and a couple of months later, they've got something looking a little bit like this. They've started to put some basic corals in their tank. Now, bear with me when I show this image here saying basic corals. I'm not meaning to be disrespectful or anything of the corals here. These are some beautiful corals, and I don't mean to say they're basic. I mean probably more basic care. This is probably the minimum I would aim for most people starting. I find even if they say they are talking a fish-only tank, they will want to add these corals down the track. So that's our basic coral tank, which is the image I would show for people that are looking for what their tank goal is. We'll go down to the next step along the line. All right, so once we've gone past our basic coral tank, so you've got people looking at a fish-only tank, then we look into some easy to care for coral tanks. Then we go up to the next level here, which is what I call the intermediate difficulty. And you can see that compared to the basic coral tank, where we've got LPS and soft corals there mostly, coming to this one here, not only have we increased the fish bio load quite a lot, but the diversity of corals in this tank has as well probably almost exploded. We've got a huge variety of corals in this tank, and it's quite a step from this basic coral tank up to the intermediate coral tank. And thankfully for most of people entering the hobby, they don't see a huge difference to their green eyes between this tank and this tank. And if that's the case, that is fine. That's great. We can tailor the equipment and the routines and maintenance around the basic coral tank more so than the intermediate difficulty. But you do need to be mindful that once they start finding their feet and they start introducing some of the more difficult corals, along some of the SPS corals that go in your tank, that they just need to tighten up a little bit more on their testing, their maintenance and routines and things like that. Now, obviously, if we've got an intermediate difficulty tank, there's a high difficulty tank, and I don't want to downplay the intermediate difficulty tank here because it is rather difficult, particularly we're talking people new to the hobby. But obviously, you go to the high difficulty where we've got a SPS dominant tank here. It's not so much the difficulty here is I guess the difficulty does increase, but it's more so just the window for success is narrowed. The corals in this tank here, particularly this one where it's running at by the look of the corals, they're relatively pale. It's running at an ultra low nutrient setting, which narrows your window for success even further. A lapse in maintenance or any sort of equipment malfunction is going to see a good portion of these corals either struggle and lose 6 months worth of coloration and growth, or even worse, potentially lose quite a lot of them. Thankfully, for most people entering into the hobby, an SPS dominant tank like this does not appeal to them. They're looking for corals that have some movement, so that's fine, but you can just use this as an opportunity to say, this is a bit of a different game. It is almost a niche within the niche, And if you're looking to go to SPS, you're going to need to re-establish what your tank goals are, and potentially what your routine and maintenance and budget can be from around there. Now, last but not least, we have specific needs tanks, which can be things like predator tanks, or stingrays, or even seahorses, a particular biotope, whatever it may be. If that's the type of outcome or a tank goal that someone has, they obviously need to be upfront with that from the start, because you're going to tailor the equipment, the maintenance and routines all around that particular animal or subset of animals. So I've got that one in there as well. Now, once you've worked out the tank goals, we need to work out the resource availability. Now, most people are very comfortable with the first one there, which is just your budget. That's obviously one of the first questions that comes up, and how much is this going to cost, and how much is going to cost ongoing is also a good follow-up question from there. Now, obviously you want to work out what's an acceptable setup budget, because sometimes people will say it's high or it's low, but that obviously varies from person to person, and depending on what tank goal they have, that can be adequate, that can be surplus, or that can be inadequate. Another thing you need to consider there is the fit and finish that is required for that particular person. If they're just happy to have the glass box looking good, and all of the cabinetry and equipment around it can sort of look a bit like a science experiment, not a problem. But if you've got someone that has a multi-million-dollar waterfront house, and all of the furniture in their house is all bespoke and handmade, there's going to be a considerable amount of budget around making sure that all of the equipment around the fish tank's looking at home there, because even if they've got a beautiful reef tank, but the cabinetry, or there's wires or pipes or things hanging out, that's not going to meet their tank goals. So you've got to consider the fit and finish there. And of course, you've also got to consider the size of the tank. That will be guided a little bit by the tank goals. But it obviously does come into budget, because that can be a fairly linear scale. Next up there, we've got the time availability. Now, it's something that you need to be very brutally honest with. People will say, particularly when they're getting into the hobby, they're very motivated and keen. I like to use the example of how much time are you going to have for your tank when you've got the flu, or you've had a bad week at work, or you've got some family things going on, whatever it may be. Your time availability for the tank is something that absolutely needs to be considered at its worst case. Everyone's got time for the tank when things are going great, but how much time are you going to have for it when it's not going great? Something that needs to be considered highly. And those two, which we'll talk about in a second, they interchange. If you don't have a lot of time, but you do have more budget, you can get assistance there, and vice versa. If you don't have the budget, but you've got the time, you can make some considerations there. Last but not least is availability or accessibility around the tank. And I don't just mean the chap there in a wheelchair. It can mean lots of things. A number of people that I talk to about not doing water changes on their tanks because they've got a bad back. That's the sort of thing you want to find out before you set the tank up, because there are things you can do to work around that. You can set up automatic water changes, or we can run plumbing to the tank, or we can set up something else. But we don't want to find out 6 months down the track that the tank's looking bad because you haven't been doing water changes because your back hurts, or because you've put a 3,000 litre tank on the 30th floor of an apartment building, and you can't be bothered carrying the water upstairs. Something we want to work out before we get to that point. It can also mean things like whereabouts you want to put the tank. Are you going to be able to physically access it, including the sump, including the back wall, around the sides? Something that needs to be considered. I don't just mean accessibility in the sense of if you're in a wheelchair or not. It's the whole kit and caboodle there. Now, that then leads us to mapping that out. Now, the two main items there that I talked about, which is your budget and time, as I said, they can be interchanged within a degree. So once someone's picked out their tank goals and they've worked out what sort of budget and time they've got, we can start mapping through. So we can say that a fish-only tank, if your budget's a little bit lower and you don't have as much time available for the tank, you're probably still going to be able to set up a relatively successful fish-only tank. again, you're still going to need a budget. You're still going to need some time, but it's just not as high as demand as some of the other tanks. Once you move up the scale a little bit, and it probably runs, if you can see my cursor there, this line across here is pretty much the same there, in that you can increase budget without increasing time, or you can increase time without increasing budget. But if you're looking at that sort of intermediate display there, you really need a bit of budget and time. You can't get away without one or the other there so much. But with the basic corals tank, you probably could get away with a bit more time than budget, or a bit more budget than time. And then last but not least, obviously, we've got our high difficulty SPS dominated display, or our specific biotope tank. Now, the point of this little graph here is just to be very straightforward and very upfront with the person looking to set up a tank, to point out that if they are going to say that they're going to start with this, but eventually want to leak into this area, they're going to need either more time or more budget. But particularly, we want to plan for that from the start, because if we try and do that down the track, it's going to take even more time or even more budget. Now, the key part of that is identifying gaps, because gaps exist. That's fine. That's life. The key is how we identify and then solve the gaps. So the key really here is to be realistic. Like I said, we want to be mindful of, if you say that you've got time for the tank, you may have time now while it's new and exciting, but are you still going to have time in a year and a half? Are you still going to be able to spend the 2 hours a week testing water, doing a water change, cleaning glass, and checking some of the health of the corals? If not, probably set yourself up for the basic coral tank or the fish only tank. Difficult to ask sometimes, but even if you can write it down and have the person review that often, the key there, I guess, really is to identify before we start, because it's going to only amplify things as we go further. Now, addressing those gaps, as I touched on before, time is money, money is time. You can get people to help service your tank. Someone like Cam, the fish guy here from Galleria Aquatica, does a fantastic job. And even if that's not something ongoing, if it's once a month, once every 3 months, once every year, whatever it may be, someone to come in with a professional eye to run over the tank, see you, make sure you're on track. Something like that can be very handy. Infrastructure, like we talked about earlier, if you do have a bad back and you're going to push through it at the start because it's exciting and you want a fish tank, it's probably not sustainable. We can build some infrastructure in place there to help remove some of these challenges. So I like to think it's a good idea to ask people what's their least exciting things, what they don't want to do most on the tank. More often than not, it's water changes. So I try to encourage people to set up automatic water changes, or at least semi-automated water changes, so that they don't have to carry buckets of water around, because I know if they don't like doing it now, that will lead to not doing it very often, and that will lead to not doing it at all down the track. Lastly there, adjusting your tank goals, and it can be a difficult one, or sometimes not as difficult if people are saying they want intermediate corals, but you can see that they're probably not going to have the time or the budget, or a combination of the two, or the accessibility of the tank's going to be a problem. We can either look at coming back a step, maybe just keeping out of the SPS range, maybe keeping to your soft corals, keeping to some zoanthus, some of the more easier to care for corals, or even coming back to a fish only tank to still get, they're going to have more enjoyment having a successful fish only tank than an unsuccessful basic coral or intermediate coral tank. All right, now we'll come through to final tips. Now, these are just parts that I couldn't really fit onto any other slides. I've got a list of 5 tips here. Now, the first one, and it's one that it's difficult because it's just human nature, but is to instill patience. It's something that hasn't changed in this hobby for the number of years I've been in it. You need to have patience in this game, and establishing those timelines of how long it's going to take a tank to cycle, how long it's going to look ugly for after that, how long before that you can really start putting corals or some of those other fish in the tank, and how long until those corals really start to grow. You really need to be very upfront with that and make sure that the person totally understands it, so they don't expect the dream tank outcome within 3 to 6 months, because more often than not, that is what people think is the timeline when we're talking. It really probably is a good few years. Next piece of advice I'd like to give everyone looking to get into this game is to partner up with a good local fish shop. There's nothing more valuable in this hobby than having a good fish shop that can guide you through the pros tank. They know your equipment, they know your scenario, they can recommend the right pieces of livestock and equipment to help see you succeed. And if you partner up with a good local fish shop that's not just looking to make a sale today, but looking to keep a customer for the next 10 years, they will make sure that they're not setting you up to fail. Another advice I like to give people is to find a tank mentor and also a tank buddy. If you can find someone that's at about the same stage as you in the hobby as your buddy, and you can sort of bounce ideas off each other, you can keep track, make sure you're ticking along and riding the highs and lows with each other, but also find a tank mentor. It doesn't necessarily need to be someone that you actually have contact with, but if there's a tank that you're aspiring to and they've got a tank journal online or something, and you can follow along with some of the successes and non-successes they've had, I feel like that's a good, if nothing else, a good mental health component, just to see that even these people that you look to as not having all the answers don't always have all the answers, and that they go through challenges as well. Next point I'd like to bring up is to review your tank goals often. Don't forget about them. Don't make it something that you just listed down on a bit of paper when you're setting up the tank. Check in on it quarterly. Make sure that your tank goals haven't changed. If you haven't now started to bleed into the, gone too far. Haven't started to bleed into the next level of coral or fish, and if you have, that's okay, but just realize that that's going to make you need to assess your infrastructure again, or your routines. You just need to be honest with yourself if you're moving from one category to the next. And my last and final piece of advice is to enjoy the highs and to move on from the lows, because I find that reef keeping is an absolute roller coaster. Anyone that says they've never lost a fish or a coral or had some challenges or had some algae they couldn't defeat or a pest or something like that is either new to the hobby or is lying to you, because it happens to all of us. And I think that's actually what is the draw to the hobby, is that you're constantly faced with challenges that you can hopefully overcome, and that's the reward of the hobby. So you're going to have some lows, and there's going to be times where you don't like the look of the tank. You need to move on from them and take the challenge and take it on the chin. But on the same hand, enjoy the highs while they're there, because you know there will be lows. So when your tank's looking great, be proud of it. Take photos of it. Share it with your mates. It is what it is. That's all the excitement. So I guess I'll wrap my presentation up there. I think I've possibly gone a couple minutes over, but hopefully not too bad. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the section, and we can cover those in the Q&A at the end of this morning group. And thank you very much for having me. I hope for a non-scientific presentation that you guys found it enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was absolutely fantastic. Just leave your slide up there for now. Just a couple of
Sure.
comments. You talk about and it was a very honest comment about if you've had fish or corals, you're going to have dead fish or corals. I had a vet friend who deals a lot with large animals on farms make a comment to me just this year, and it sort of made a lot of sense, and I'd never actually heard it before. And he said, if you've got livestock, at some stage you're going to have dead stock. And you know, the fact is that animals sometimes die because we don't look after them properly, but in a lot of cases it'll be sometimes if you're doing things properly, they're still going to die just because their lifespan is not as long as ours. So that was the other thing. I really like the idea of having a goal, and one of my favourite all times books is by a guy called Stephen Covey, C-O-V-E-Y. If any of you haven't read it, I urge you to get it. I read it probably 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, and it was a life-changing book. It's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, and it's either the third or the fourth habit, and I don't remember the exact order of the habits. It was begin with the end in mind. So in other words, know what you're wanting before you start. And so I thought that was a really, really useful tip to have. So thank you for that. That was excellent.
All right, guys, there you have it. My humble tips or methodology for finding success in the home reef aquarium. If you're watching this channel, you've probably already started your reef tank, in which case it's not too late. I still think it's really important to pick out some goals for your tank. Find yourself a reefing buddy, find yourself a reefing mentor, review your goals often, and try to stay true to it. It just keeps you on track. It's a very emotional hobby and we can get swayed into different paths all too often. So stick true to your goals and you will reach your goals. Now, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, as always, guys, pop it in the comment section down below. You know me, I reply to every single one of these questions. So if you do need to reach out to me, that's the best way to get me. You can get me there. Till next time, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe, keep reefing. Bye.